The Cold War at its most fragile. In November of 1983, the world did not know how close it may have come to nuclear war. There were no breaking news alerts, no viral headlines, no dramatic speeches announcing danger. Instead, there was silence. A routine NATO command exercise was scheduled to take place in Western Europe. On paper, it was nothing extraordinary. It was called Able Archer 83. It was supposed to be practice. But in Moscow, something felt different. The year 1983 was already one of the most tense years of the entire Cold War. The relationship between the United States and the Soviet Union had deteriorated sharply. Trust was nearly gone. Both superpowers possessed thousands of nuclear warheads, many on hair-trigger alert. At the center of this tension was the President of the United States, Ronald Reagan. Reagan had taken office in 1981 with a strong anti-Soviet stance. He believed the Soviet system was morally bankrupt. In March of 1983, he publicly referred to the Soviet Union as the evil empire. To many Americans, this was powerful rhetoric. To Soviet leaders, it was confirmation of something terrifying. They believed Reagan might actually be preparing for war. Earlier that same year, the United States announced the Strategic Defense Initiative, sometimes called Star Wars. It was a proposal to build a missile defense system that could potentially shoot down incoming nuclear weapons from space. To American audiences, it sounded futuristic and defensive. To Moscow, it looked like preparation for a first strike. Because if one side could block retaliation, nuclear deterrence would no longer work. The Cold War had always been balanced on the idea of mutual destruction. If either side launched nuclear weapons, the other could respond with equal devastation. That fear kept both sides cautious. But if that balance shifted, even slightly, paranoia would grow. And paranoia was already growing. In September of 1983, just 2 months before Able Archer, the Soviet Union shot down a civilian passenger plane. Korean Airlines Flight 7 shot down after mistakenly believing it was a spy aircraft. All 269 people on board were killed. The incident shocked the world. Western governments condemned the Soviet Union. The Kremlin believed it was under increasing pressure and possible infiltration. Meanwhile, NATO was deploying new nuclear missiles in Europe, Pershing II missiles and cruise missiles, capable of reaching Soviet territory in minutes. From the Soviet perspective, this changed everything. Warning times would shrink. Decision times would shrink. Mistakes would become more likely. Inside the Kremlin, leaders were aging and suspicious. Yuri Andropov, the general secretary of the Communist Party, had previously led the KGB. He deeply distrusted the West. He believed American intelligence agencies were capable of deception operations designed to disguise a real nuclear strike as an exercise. That belief would become critical. Because in November 1983, NATO would conduct one of its most realistic nuclear command exercises ever. But the Soviet Union did not see it as practice. They saw it as possible preparation for the real thing. And so, before Able Archer even began, the world was already in a fragile state. Missiles were ready. Submarines were hidden beneath oceans. Bomber crews were trained to launch within minutes. Both sides watched each other constantly. The Cold War had lasted decades. It had survived crises in Berlin, Cuba, and countless proxy wars around the globe. But 1983 would prove to be uniquely dangerous because both sides misunderstood each other at the same time. In Washington, NATO leaders believed they were simply maintaining readiness. In Moscow, Soviet intelligence began to fear something else. They feared surprise. They feared deception. They feared that a nuclear first strike might begin not with explosions, but with a simulation. And so when NATO prepared Able Archer 83, they did not realize how closely they were being watched. They did not realize how frightened the other side had become. They did not realize that some Soviet commanders would soon place nuclear forces on heightened alert. All because of an exercise. As November approached, coded messages were drafted. Secure communication lines were tested. Simulated nuclear release procedures were rehearsed. To NATO officers, it was professional routine. To Soviet analysts, it was something far more dangerous. This was not just another drill. This was the moment when practice almost became reality. And it would take years, even decades, before the full truth of how close the world may have come to catastrophe would be revealed. The story of Able Archer 83 is not dramatic in the way movies portray war. There were no explosions, no visible missile launches, no public countdown clocks. But behind closed doors, in secure command bunkers, human beings made decisions under fear and uncertainty. And in nuclear strategy, fear can be more dangerous than weapons. This is the story of the NATO exercise that almost triggered nuclear war. Reagan, rhetoric, and rising fear in Moscow. By 1983, the Cold War was not new. It had already lasted nearly 4 decades. Entire generations had grown up under the quiet shadow of nuclear weapons. School children practiced drills. Military planners rehearsed doomsday scenarios. Politicians spoke carefully, sometimes aggressively, about the balance of power. But something felt different in the early 1980s. The atmosphere had hardened. At the center of this shift was the President of the United States, Ronald Reagan. Reagan did not approach the Soviet Union the way some of his predecessors had. He did not emphasize détente, the easing of tensions that had characterized parts of the 1970s. Instead, he believed the Soviet system was fundamentally flawed and morally wrong. In March of 1983, he delivered a speech that would echo through the Kremlin. In that speech, he described the Soviet Union as an evil empire. In the United States, many supporters applauded the clarity of his language. They saw it as strength. They believed firmness would deter aggression. In Moscow, the reaction was different. To Soviet leaders, this was not simply rhetoric. It sounded like ideological preparation for confrontation. At that time, the Soviet Union was led by Yuri Andropov. Andropov was not a man who trusted easily. Before becoming General Secretary, he had led the KGB for 15 years. He had spent his career studying Western intelligence operations. He believed that deception, misinformation, and surprise were common tools of strategy. From his perspective, the United States was unpredictable. And unpredictability is dangerous in a nuclear standoff. Just weeks after the Evil Empire speech, Reagan introduced the Strategic Defense Initiative, SDI. The idea was bold. It proposed a system that could intercept and destroy incoming ballistic missiles, possibly using space-based technology. In theory, it would protect the United States from nuclear attack. But nuclear deterrence had always relied on vulnerability. If both sides were vulnerable, neither would risk striking first. If one side could defend itself from retaliation, the balance would break. To Soviet strategists, SDI looked less like defense and more like preparation for a future in which the United States could launch a first strike and survive the response. It created fear, and fear changes how intelligence is interpreted. At the same time, NATO was moving forward with the deployment of new intermediate-range nuclear missiles in Europe. The Pershing II missile was especially alarming to Moscow. It could reach Soviet territory in a matter of minutes. Decision time would shrink dramatically. In a crisis, Soviet leaders might have only a few minutes to determine whether radar signals were real or false alarms. And false alarms had already occurred. Earlier in 1983, a Soviet early warning officer named Stanislav Petrov faced what appeared to be incoming American missiles on his monitoring systems. The system indicated a launch. The protocol suggested retaliation. But Petrov hesitated. He judged that the warning was likely a malfunction. He was correct. It was a false alarm. The world did not know his name at the time. His decision remained secret, but it revealed something important. Technology was imperfect, and human judgment stood between error and catastrophe. Now imagine that same fragile system operating during a NATO exercise that simulates nuclear war. Imagine radar operators already nervous. Imagine intelligence analysts already expecting deception. In Moscow, a secret program had already begun. It was called RYAN. RYAN was not a missile or a military unit. It was an intelligence operation designed to detect signs that the West might be preparing a surprise nuclear strike. Soviet agents across Europe and North America were instructed to look for indicators, unusual military movements, blood bank activity, emergency government preparations, anything that might signal imminent war. The instructions were serious. The leadership feared that NATO might disguise a real attack within an exercise. And in late 1983, NATO was preparing one of its most realistic command exercises yet. From the American perspective, it was procedural. From the Soviet perspective, it could be camouflage. Reagan himself did not intend to start a war in 1983. Later in his presidency, he would pursue arms reduction talks and eventually meet with Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev to reduce nuclear arsenals. But in 1983, Gorbachev was not yet in power. Trust had not yet begun to rebuild. Instead, suspicion dominated. The language between the superpowers was harsh. Military exercises were growing in scale. Missiles were moving into position. Each side believed it was acting defensively. Each side believed the other might be preparing something aggressive. This is how near catastrophes often develop. Not through clear intent, but through misunderstanding layered upon fear. By the time November approached, Soviet intelligence had already raised its alert posture in response to what it perceived as increasing NATO activity. They were watching closely. Every coded message, every movement of aircraft, every adjustment in command procedures. And when Able Archer 83 began simulating the transition from conventional war to nuclear release procedures, Soviet observers noticed something new. The exercise included elements that had not appeared in previous years. More realistic communications, more involvement of high-level officials, more detailed nuclear authorization steps. To NATO planners, this was professional refinement. To Soviet analysts, it looked disturbingly real. And because of everything that had happened earlier that year, the rhetoric, the missile deployments, the airline tragedy, the false alarms, the Kremlin's interpretation leaned toward worst-case scenarios. The Cold War was built on deterrence, but deterrence depends on understanding. In 1983, understanding was fading, and the line between simulation and reality was about to become dangerously thin. The nuclear balance of terror. To understand why a military exercise in 1983 could cause real fear of nuclear war, we have to slow down. We have to step back. Because Able Archer 83 did not occur in isolation. It existed inside a system built over decades, where the survival of entire nations depended on a theory both simple and terrifying. That theory was called mutually assured destruction. MAD. The idea was cold and mathematical. If the United States launched nuclear weapons at the Soviet Union would launch its own weapons in response. Both nations would suffer catastrophic losses. Neither would truly win. And because the consequences were so devastating, neither side would dare strike first. It was stability built on fear. By the early 1980s, both superpowers possessed thousands of nuclear warheads. The United States maintained land-based intercontinental ballistic missiles, submarine-launched ballistic missiles, and long-range strategic bombers. This structure was known as the nuclear triad. The Soviet Union maintained the same. Missiles sat in underground silos across North America and the Soviet countryside. Submarines carrying nuclear warheads moved silently beneath the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. Strategic bombers waited on airfields, crews trained to launch within minutes. Some weapons were so powerful they could destroy entire metropolitan regions in a single strike. Others were smaller, designed for battlefield use in Europe. The scale was difficult to comprehend, and the timing was even more frightening. If radar systems detected incoming missiles, national leaders would have only minutes to decide whether to retaliate. The United States relied on early warning systems and command structures headquartered in facilities like the Pentagon and the North American Aerospace Defense Command. The Soviet Union relied on its own network of radars and command bunkers. At the top of the Soviet structure stood leaders in the Kremlin, under the authority of General Secretary Yuri Andropov. In Washington, command authority ultimately rested with President Ronald Reagan. But in a crisis, the decision chain would compress. Information would move fast. Judgment would have to move faster. Both nations developed procedures to ensure retaliation even if leadership was destroyed. The logic was grim. If you cannot prevent being attacked, you must guarantee the attacker cannot escape punishment. This system kept the peace, but only as long as both sides believed the other was rational. In Europe, the situation was especially sensitive. NATO had placed nuclear weapons in allied countries as part of its deterrence strategy. American nuclear bombs were stationed in places like West Germany, Belgium, and the Netherlands. The presence of these weapons meant that a war between NATO and the Warsaw Pact would almost certainly escalate to nuclear use. And escalation could happen quickly. That is why NATO conducted exercises. Exercises were meant to test procedures. They simulated scenarios in which conventional war in Europe might escalate to tactical nuclear weapons, and eventually to strategic exchange. These drills were usually predictable. They followed patterns. They included known communication formats. But in November 1983, the exercise called Able Archer 83 introduced new elements. For the first time, parts of the simulation involved realistic nuclear release procedures. Messages were transmitted using actual formats. Command participation appeared higher level. To NATO planners, this increased realism made the training more effective. But realism can be dangerous when observed from the outside, especially by an adversary already primed to expect deception. Earlier that same year, a false alarm incident had shown just how fragile the system could be. Soviet officer Stanislav Petrov had judged that a missile warning was incorrect, preventing a potential escalation. His decision revealed something essential. Technology was not flawless. Sensors could misread sunlight reflections. Computers could misinterpret signals. Human beings stood between signal and response. Now imagine that same environment during a NATO drill that simulates nuclear escalation. Imagine Soviet radar operators detecting increased communications. Imagine intelligence officers noticing unusual air movements. Imagine analysts reviewing coded traffic that resembles wartime transmission. In a calm political climate, these signs might be dismissed as routine. In 1983, they were not. The Soviet Union had already begun an intelligence effort called Operation RYAN, searching for indicators of a surprise Western attack. Agents were instructed to monitor even small changes: increased lighting at government buildings, blood bank collections, unusual military readiness. When a system is designed to look for danger, it often finds it. And when the nuclear balance depends on interpreting signals correctly, misinterpretation becomes lethal. The balance of terror worked because both sides believed they understood the rules. But in 1983, the rules felt uncertain. Was the United States testing new procedures before a strike? Was NATO disguising preparation as exercise? Was the Soviet Union overreacting to normal military planning? No one fully understood the other's internal fears. Each side saw only its own caution and the other's potential aggression. This is how nuclear crises rarely begin with shouting. They begin with uncertainty, with incomplete information, with assumptions layered on top of assumptions. By the time Able Archer 83 moved into its simulated nuclear release phase, Soviet leadership had already elevated certain military units. Some aircraft were prepared. Some missile forces were placed on heightened alert. From Moscow's perspective, caution was necessary. From NATO's perspective, nothing unusual was happening. The balance of terror still held. But for several days in November 1983, that balance rested not only on weapons, but on interpretation. And interpretation can fail. NATO's command structure and the machinery of simulation. By November 1983, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization had existed for more than 3 decades. Formed in 1949, NATO was built on a simple promise: an attack on one member would be considered an attack on all. But behind that promise stood something far more complex: a vast military command structure stretching across continents. At the center of that structure was NATO's integrated command system, headquartered in Europe. Its supreme military authority was known as the Supreme Allied Commander Europe, often abbreviated as SACEUR. In 1983, that position was held by U.S. General Bernard W. Rogers. From secure facilities in Europe, SACEUR oversaw planning for the defense of Western Europe against a possible invasion by the Warsaw Pact. And that possibility was taken very seriously. Throughout the Cold War, NATO planners believed that if war broke out, it would likely begin conventionally, with tanks crossing into West Germany, aircraft engaging over Central Europe, artillery firing across fortified borders. But they also believed that conventional war might not stay conventional for long. If NATO forces began losing ground, nuclear weapons could be introduced to halt the advance. And once nuclear weapons were introduced, escalation might be unavoidable. This was not fantasy, it was doctrine. That doctrine required constant rehearsal. And so every year, NATO conducted exercises to simulate command and control during wartime. Able Archer was one of those exercises. It was not a field maneuver involving large troop movements. It was a command post exercise, a simulation focused on communication, authorization, and coordination. The 1983 version, known officially as Able Archer 83, was scheduled for early November. On paper, it was routine. In practice, it was different. Unlike previous years, Able Archer 83 incorporated new procedures. Messages were encoded in formats that more closely resembled real wartime communications. The simulation included the full progression from conventional conflict to nuclear release authorization. In earlier exercises, some of these steps had been abstract. In 1983, they were detailed. Nuclear release procedures were not casual matters. They required strict authentication codes, multiple layers of confirmation, coordination between national governments and NATO command authorities. In the United States, nuclear weapons in Europe required presidential authorization. In Britain and other NATO countries, national leaders would also have roles in approval. The exercise simulated these steps. It simulated escalation. It simulated crisis. From NATO's perspective, realism increased readiness. But realism also increases ambiguity, especially when observed from the outside. The Soviet Union did not have full insight into NATO's internal planning. It relied on intelligence sources, satellite imagery, intercepted communications informants. And in late 1983, Soviet analysts were already operating under heightened suspicion. Earlier that year, tensions had escalated sharply. The downing of Korean Airlines Flight 7 shoot-down had intensified global outrage. NATO missile deployments in Europe were proceeding. The rhetoric from Washington remained firm. Inside the Kremlin, leadership under Yuri Andropov viewed Western actions through a lens of caution and distrust. So when NATO began transmitting exercise messages that looked indistinguishable from real nuclear release communications, Soviet intelligence noticed. The exercise included participation from multiple NATO headquarters. It involved communications moving from field commands to higher authorities. It practiced transitions in alert levels. To NATO officers inside secure bunkers, it was controlled and clearly simulated. To Soviet listeners intercepting coded traffic, it was opaque. They could see activity increasing. They could see procedures escalating. But they could not see the word exercise stamped clearly on each action. And in nuclear strategy, perception matters as much as intent. There was another factor. The early 1980s had seen increased attention to surprise attack scenarios. Both sides studied historical examples, Pearl Harbor, Operation Barbarossa, as reminders that wars often begin without warning. Soviet planners feared a Western first strike that might be disguised as routine activity. An able archer by design was routine, which made it paradoxically suspicious. During the exercise, NATO simulated a scenario in which conventional conflict escalated step by step. First came rising tensions, then conventional engagement, then requests for nuclear release authorization. Each stage followed doctrine. Each message followed structure. Each signal appeared disciplined. To NATO participants, this was professionalism. To Soviet observers, it could resemble preparation. Because from the outside, there is no clear line separating rehearsal from reality, especially when both look identical. As Able Archer progressed, the Soviet military began adjusting its own posture. Certain air units were placed on higher readiness. Some nuclear-capable aircraft were reportedly prepared. Missile forces increased alert status. These were precautionary moves, defensive in intention. But in a nuclear standoff, defensive measures can be misread as offensive ones. And so, during several days in November 1983, two nuclear superpowers conducted parallel activities. One side simulated escalation. The other side prepared in case the simulation was real. Neither side fully understood how the other was interpreting events. The machinery of deterrence continued turning. Messages moved through encrypted channels. Commanders followed protocol. And yet beneath that routine surface, uncertainty was growing. Able Archer 83 was not a battlefield confrontation. It was a communication event. A test of systems, a rehearsal of authority. But in a world where nuclear war could begin with a signal, even a rehearsal carried risk. The structure designed to prevent chaos had briefly created confusion. And confusion, when paired with nuclear weapons, is never harmless. The Soviet intelligence panicked. By the time November 1983 arrived, the Soviet Union was not calm. It was watchful. Inside Moscow, intelligence agencies were operating under a directive that had quietly reshaped their priorities. That directive was known as Operation RYAN. RYAN was not a weapon system. It was not a missile or a radar installation. It was a search for signs that the West might be preparing a surprise nuclear attack. The program had been initiated under the leadership of Yuri Andropov, who before leading the Soviet Union had directed the KGB. Andropov believed the United States might attempt what strategists feared most, a decapitating first strike designed to cripple Soviet leadership before retaliation could be organized. He did not view this as paranoia. He viewed it as preparation. Soviet intelligence officers stationed across Europe and North America were instructed to monitor subtle indicators. They were told to report unusual activity in government buildings. They were told to observe military bases for heightened readiness. They were even instructed to watch blood banks for sudden increases in collection, on the assumption that wartime preparation might require medical reserves. The instructions were detailed. They were serious, and they created a psychological shift. When an intelligence system is tasked with finding signs of imminent war, it begins to interpret ambiguous signals as evidence. Normal activities can look suspicious. Routine exercises can look like camouflage. By late 1983, relations with the United States had deteriorated sharply. President Ronald Reagan had taken a firm public stance against Soviet policies. NATO was proceeding with the deployment of Pershing II missiles in Europe, weapons that could strike Soviet territory within minutes. Earlier in the year, the Soviet air defense system had shot down Korean Airlines Flight 7 shootdome, believing it to be a hostile aircraft. The global reaction had been swift and condemnatory. Moscow felt increasingly isolated and under pressure. Then came November, when NATO began its annual command post exercise, officially known as Able Archer 83. Soviet intelligence was already primed to interpret events cautiously. But something about this year's exercise stood out. The communications looked more realistic. The procedures appeared more detailed. The escalation simulated in the exercise, from conventional conflict to nuclear authorization, followed patterns that Soviet analysts had studied as potential real-world scenarios. And there was one more factor. Able Archer 83 reportedly involved participation at high levels of NATO command. From Moscow's vantage point, this increased realism suggested seriousness. If a real attack were to be disguised as an exercise, it might look exactly like this. In intelligence analysis, context shapes interpretation. If leaders believe war is unlikely, exercises are just exercises. If leaders fear surprise, exercises become suspicious. Inside Soviet military districts, reports began flowing upward. Analysts compared intercepted communications to wartime templates. They evaluated aircraft movements. They assessed alert postures. The possibility, however remote, that NATO might be using Able Archer as cover for a first strike could not be dismissed lightly. And so precautionary measures began. Some Soviet units in Eastern Europe were placed on heightened alert. Certain nuclear-capable aircraft were reportedly readied. Missile forces were evaluated for responsiveness. These actions were defensive. They were meant to ensure readiness in case of an attack. But nuclear deterrence is delicate. When one side increases readiness, the other side may interpret it as preparation for aggression. Fortunately, in this case, NATO did not detect a significant change in Soviet posture, or at least did not fully grasp its meaning at the time. This mutual opacity prevented escalation, but it also reveals something unsettling. The United States and its NATO allies did not realize how seriously the Soviet Union was interpreting the exercise. And the Soviet Union did not fully know that NATO believed everything was routine. Each side operated inside its own information bubble. Each side believed it was acting rationally. The panic inside Soviet intelligence circles was not public. It did not appear in newspapers. It did not trigger public speeches. It existed in classified cables, internal memoranda, and alert adjustments. For several days in November 1983, analysts in Moscow studied incoming data with heightened concern. They asked difficult questions. Was this the beginning? Was this the camouflage? Were the patterns consistent with doctrine? When you are searching for signs of war, uncertainty becomes heavy. And in a nuclear system, even small uncertainty carries enormous weight. There were no missiles launched during Able Archer 83. There were no explosions, but the fear inside parts of the Soviet intelligence apparatus was real. The world did not know it at the time. NATO did not know it at the time. Even many within the Soviet system did not know how seriously some analysts were interpreting events. It would take years, and eventually the collapse of the Soviet Union, for documents and testimony to reveal how tense those days had been. The panic was quiet. The alerts were precautionary. But the margin between simulation and misunderstanding had narrowed. And when nuclear weapons stand ready, narrow margins matter. Tell me when you want. Operation RYAN and the search for the first strike. Long before Able Archer 83 began, the Soviet Union had already started preparing for something it feared deeply. Not invasion, not gradual escalation, but sudden, silent annihilation. This fear took institutional form in a program known as Operation RYAN. RYAN was launched in 1981 under the direction of Yuri Andropov, then head of the KGB, and soon to become General Secretary. The name was an acronym derived from Russian words meaning nuclear missile attack. Its purpose was simple in theory: detect signs that the United States and NATO were preparing a surprise nuclear first strike. But detecting a first strike before it happens is extraordinarily difficult. A surprise attack is designed to look like normal activity until the moment it begins. And so Soviet intelligence officers were given a new mission: search constantly for indicators. Agents stationed in Western capitals were instructed to monitor government behavior. They were told to observe changes in military communications, civil defense activity, even subtle shifts in political routines. The instructions were meticulous. Were lights staying on unusually late at defense ministries? Were key officials traveling unexpectedly? Were blood banks collecting more than usual? Were NATO aircraft dispersing to alternate airfields? Each small change could, in theory, be a signal. The logic was rooted in fear. Soviet planners believed that if the United States ever attempted a first strike, it would try to cripple Soviet command structures before retaliation could be ordered. The strike might target leadership bunkers, communication nodes, and missile silos. In such a scenario, seconds would matter. Minutes would determine survival. This fear was intensified by technological changes in the early 1980s. The deployment of Pershing II missiles in Europe reduced warning times dramatically. A missile launched from West Germany could reach Moscow in approximately 10 minutes. 10 minutes. Not enough time for careful debate. Not enough time for prolonged verification. Just enough time for alarm. Earlier in 1983, a false missile warning incident had already revealed how fragile the system could be. Soviet officer Stanislav Petrov had received automated signals suggesting incoming American missiles. He judged them to be false alarms. He was correct. But the incident demonstrated that even advanced systems could fail. When Able Archer 83 began in November, Operation RYAN was already active. Intelligence officers were already primed to search for patterns consistent with a first strike. Now imagine the environment. Tensions were high. President Ronald Reagan had publicly criticized Soviet policies. The Strategic Defense Initiative had raised fears of destabilizing deterrence. The memory of Korean Airlines Flight 7 shootdown was still fresh. And inside NATO command centers, a highly realistic nuclear command exercise was unfolding, Able Archer 83. From the Western perspective, Able Archer was a simulation. From the Soviet perspective, it might have been something else. Operation RYAN analysts began comparing observed NATO activities with their checklist of potential indicators. Were communications increasing? Yes. Were command structures activating in realistic patterns? Yes. Were nuclear authorization procedures being rehearsed? Yes. The question became not whether these activities were occurring, but what they meant. Inside the KGB and Soviet military intelligence, reports climbed upward through bureaucratic layers. Each report carried uncertainty. Each carried the possibility of misinterpretation. But in a system conditioned to expect surprise, caution tends to escalate. The Soviet Union began adjusting readiness levels. Certain air units were placed on alert. Nuclear-capable aircraft in Eastern Europe were reportedly prepared for rapid deployment. Some missile forces heightened their posture. These were precautionary measures. They were not offensive moves. But in a nuclear standoff, readiness can look like preparation. The most dangerous aspect of Operation RYAN was not that it existed. It was that it changed perception. When a leadership believes a first strike is plausible, it interprets ambiguous information as evidence. When it believes war is unlikely, it interprets the same information as routine. By 1983, Soviet leadership feared the worst. And Operation RYAN ensured that every NATO exercise would be examined for hidden intent. Able Archer 83 happened at the exact moment when suspicion was strongest. That timing mattered. Had the exercise occurred in a calmer year, it might have passed without concern. But in 1983, after months of escalating tension, it intersected with a mindset shaped by fear. The nuclear balance depended not only on weapons and treaties. It depended on interpretation. Operation RYAN was designed to prevent surprise, but it also increased the risk of false alarm. Because when you are searching urgently for danger, normal events can look like confirmation. For several days in November 1983, the Soviet Union treated Able Archer not as a harmless drill, but as a potential signal. And the world continued turning, unaware of how closely it was being watched. Tell me when you want. How Able Archer 83 was designed. To understand why Able Archer 83 created fear inside the Soviet Union, we have to slow down and look carefully at how the exercise was built. Because it was not chaotic. It was not dramatic. It was structured, planned months in advance. Able Archer was part of a larger series of NATO autumn exercises known as Autumn Forge. These annual drills tested coordination between NATO forces across Europe. Most of the movements involved conventional readiness, troops, logistics, communication networks. But Able Archer was different. It focused not on battlefield maneuvering, but on command authority. Its purpose was to simulate how NATO leadership would transition from conventional conflict to nuclear release procedures. That transition was the most sensitive phase in any war plan. And in 1983, the designers of Able Archer 83 made the scenario more realistic than in previous years. The simulation followed a scripted path. First, political tensions would rise between NATO and the Warsaw Pact. Then conventional forces would engage. As the simulated conflict worsened, NATO commanders would request authorization to use nuclear weapons. These requests would move through proper channels up to national governments. Messages would be encoded. Authentication procedures would be followed. And mock nuclear release codes would be transmitted using formats closely resembling real ones. This realism was intentional. NATO planners believed that if an exercise was too artificial, it would fail to prepare commanders for actual crisis. So they reduced obvious indicators that it was merely practice. They used authentic communication channels. They rehearsed decision-making timelines. They practiced shifting alert conditions. From inside NATO headquarters, this looked like professionalism. From outside, it looked opaque. The exercise ran from November 7 to November 11, 1983. During those days, NATO headquarters across Europe participated. Command centers transmitted messages reflecting escalating conditions. Simulated nuclear strikes were approved on paper. The scenario included participation from high-level officials, adding further realism. This is where perception became critical. Soviet intelligence, already operating under Operation RYAN, observed increased NATO communication traffic. They saw procedures resembling wartime escalation. They saw command structures activating in patterns consistent with crisis. But they could not see the internal context. They could not hear NATO officers reminding each other that it was a drill. They could not read the exercise script. They only saw the signals. And the signals matched what a real transition to nuclear war might look like. In Moscow, leadership under Yuri Andropov had already grown deeply suspicious of Western intentions. Earlier that year, rhetoric from President Ronald Reagan had intensified ideological confrontation. Missile deployments in Europe had reduced warning times. False alarms had shaken confidence in early warning systems. Now, NATO appeared to be rehearsing nuclear release in a way that looked indistinguishable from the real process. The design of Able Archer 83 contained no malicious intent. It did not conceal a genuine attack. It did not involve secret strike preparations. But it did include something new, a level of authenticity that blurred the line between simulation and action. Military exercises are meant to build readiness. Yet when two nuclear superpowers are watching each other constantly, realism can create anxiety. Because the safer an exercise becomes internally, the more ambiguous it may appear externally. The designers of Able Archer 83 likely saw their improvements as necessary modernization. They could not fully predict how those improvements would be interpreted in Moscow. And so during those November days, two parallel realities existed. Inside NATO command rooms, officers calmly followed scripted escalation procedures. Inside parts of the Soviet intelligence system, analysts compared those procedures to checklists of possible first strike indicators. Each side believed it was behaving rationally. Each side lacked full visibility into the other's mindset. This is how near misses occur. Not through reckless action, but through mirrored caution. Able Archer 83 was carefully designed. It was professionally executed. It was fully controlled. And yet, because of timing, context, and fear, it became something more than a drill in the eyes of those watching from the east. When the simulation began to feel real. On November 7, 1983, Able Archer 83 officially began. Inside NATO command centers, officers settled into their roles. Communications lines were active. Secure systems were tested. The scripted scenario unfolded as planned. At first, nothing appeared extraordinary. The early stages of Able Archer 83 simulated rising political tension between NATO and the Warsaw Pact. Reports described hypothetical troop movements. Diplomatic warnings were exchanged in the fictional scenario. Conventional forces were placed on alert. All of this had happened before in previous exercises. But this year, something subtle was different. The realism was deeper. Instead of clearly artificial message formats, the exercise used authentic nuclear command procedures. Instead of simplified scripts, it followed detailed escalation timelines. Instead of symbolic steps, it practiced actual authorization pathways. Inside NATO headquarters, this felt like responsible preparation. Inside Soviet intelligence networks, it felt like something else. Because realism reduces visible boundaries. From Moscow's perspective, intercepted communications were increasing. The language of those communications resembled wartime codes. Command levels appeared elevated. Certain NATO air units showed changes in readiness consistent with crisis simulation. The problem was not what NATO was doing. The problem was what Soviet analysts feared NATO might be doing. Operation RYAN had conditioned intelligence officers to search for indicators of surprise attack. They were not instructed to assume peace. They were instructed to assume risk. So as Able Archer moved from simulated conventional conflict toward simulated nuclear escalation, Soviet observers compared the activity to their checklist. Escalating communications. Yes. High-level command involvement. Yes. Procedures consistent with nuclear authorization. Yes. In a calmer year, these might have been dismissed as routine exercise behavior. In 1983, they fit a more dangerous pattern. Inside the Kremlin, leadership under Yuri Andropov had already grown wary of Western intentions. Andropov's background in intelligence meant he considered deception plausible. He believed a first strike might not be preceded by obvious mobilization. It might be hidden, disguised, concealed within routine activity. The Strategic Defense Initiative announced earlier that year had intensified Soviet fears about American technological advantage. President Ronald Reagan publicly framed the Soviet system as morally bankrupt. Missile deployments in Europe shortened decision times. Against this backdrop, Able Archer's realism did not feel comforting. It felt ominous. As the exercise progressed, NATO simulated requests for nuclear release authorization. In real life, such authorization would require strict authentication codes transmitted through secure channels. During the exercise, mock codes were exchanged using authentic formats. From the outside, there was no label saying practice. Soviet intelligence agencies detected what appeared to be movement consistent with higher readiness in parts of NATO. Meanwhile, Soviet military districts began adjusting their own posture. Some Warsaw Pact air forces reportedly increased alert levels. certain nuclear-capable aircraft were prepared for rapid response. Missile forces were evaluated for readiness. These were precautionary steps. But precaution in a nuclear environment can create feedback loops. If NATO had detected significant Soviet readiness changes and misinterpreted them, escalation might have followed. Fortunately, communication gaps worked both ways. NATO did not fully grasp the level of Soviet concern. The Soviet Union did not receive confirmation that Able Archer was purely an exercise. Each side operated in partial blindness. During the middle days of November, the simulation reached its most sensitive phase, the mock transition from conventional war to nuclear conflict. Inside NATO, officers calmly processed the scripted escalation. Outside, Soviet analysts wondered whether the script was real. The world beyond military headquarters remained unaware. There were no public warnings, no dramatic speeches. Ordinary citizens in Europe and North America went about their lives. But in secure rooms filled with maps and monitors, tension quietly accumulated. This is what makes the story of Able Archer 83 unsettling. There was no dramatic confrontation, no visible standoff like the Cuban Missile Crisis. Instead, there was interpretation, perception, assumption. The simulation did not cause missiles to launch. It did not trigger direct confrontation, but it pushed the Soviet Union closer to readiness than NATO understood at the time. And in nuclear strategy, readiness is not neutral. It narrows decision windows. It increases pressure. It makes mistakes more dangerous. By November 9 and 10, the exercise approached its final stage. From inside NATO, everything appeared controlled. From inside certain Soviet command structures, uncertainty remained. And uncertainty, when paired with nuclear arsenals, is never comfortable. Moscow's worst-case calculations. By the final days of Able Archer 83, the atmosphere inside parts of the Soviet defense and intelligence apparatus had grown increasingly tense. Reports from Operation RYAN agents were flowing upward. Those reports did not confirm a war was coming. They confirmed activity. And in intelligence analysis, activity can be interpreted in multiple ways. Under normal circumstances, NATO command exercises would be filed as routine training. But 1983 was not normal. Tensions between the superpowers had escalated over missile deployments, ideological confrontation, and military rhetoric. President Ronald Reagan had publicly criticized Soviet governance and accelerated military modernization programs. Earlier in the year, the downing of Korean Airlines Flight 7 Shuton had intensified distrust and international condemnation. Meanwhile, NATO's new Pershing II missiles were being deployed in Western Europe, capable of reaching Soviet territory within minutes. From Moscow's perspective, these developments could be connected. If a state wanted to prepare for a surprise nuclear strike, it would need several components. First, advanced positioning of forces. Second, realistic command rehearsals. Third, operational readiness across multiple military branches. Able Archer 83 included elements that appeared consistent with those components, even if that was never its intention. Inside the Soviet leadership circle under Yuri Andropov, worst-case analysis dominated thinking. Worst-case analysis means assuming the adversary might choose the most dangerous possible option. Not because it is likely, but because if you ignore it and it happens, the consequences are catastrophic. So Soviet intelligence officers asked difficult questions. Was the exercise a genuine drill? Or was it preparation for a coordinated first strike? Were the simulated nuclear procedures simply training, or testing how quickly NATO forces could execute real authorization? Was the timing random or strategically chosen? These questions were not rhetorical. They were operational. As Soviet analysts evaluated incoming intelligence, some indicators reportedly triggered concern. Communication traffic during the exercise appeared unusually structured. High-level participation increased realism. Certain NATO units reportedly adjusted readiness in ways that matched crisis posture templates. From the Soviet perspective, this combination fit their checklist of potential warning signs. Operation Ryan had trained them to interpret multiple signals together, not individually. One indicator alone might be meaningless. Several together could suggest danger. And when those indicators align during a realistic nuclear command exercise, anxiety rises quickly. As a precaution, some Soviet military forces reportedly increased alert status. Nuclear-capable aircraft in Eastern Europe were prepared for possible rapid deployment. Missile units evaluated readiness. These steps did not mean a launch decision had been made. They meant leaders wanted options available. In nuclear doctrine, maintaining options is critical, especially if you fear surprise. But options create visibility, and visibility into military readiness can be misread by the opposing side. Fortunately, during Able Archer 83, NATO did not interpret Soviet precautionary measures as confirmation of hostile intent. Nor did Soviet forces escalate beyond precaution. The system remained tense but contained. However, containment was fragile. If either side had misinterpreted the other's defensive actions as preparation for attack, a chain reaction might have followed. Imagine a scenario where Soviet forces increased alert status. If NATO detected that increase and assumed it signaled imminent aggression, it might have adjusted its own posture. That adjustment could then reinforce Soviet fears. Escalation through misunderstanding can accelerate rapidly. During those November days, the world stood near that possibility, even if most people were unaware. What prevented escalation? Part of the answer lies in restraint. Despite suspicion, Soviet leadership did not immediately assume Able Archer was the final step before a strike. They increased vigilance, but they did not launch preemptive action. At the same time, NATO did not escalate its posture in response to Soviet readiness changes. The mutual restraint allowed the simulation to conclude without triggering real conflict. When the exercise officially ended, communications returned to normal training patterns. The simulated nuclear release never became real. Missiles remained in their silos. Aircraft returned to standard readiness. The crisis that many analysts later described as one of the most dangerous moments of the Cold War quietly passed. But it passed unnoticed by most of the world. Only years later, after archives opened and former officials spoke publicly, did historians understand how seriously Soviet intelligence had interpreted the exercise. Documents revealed that some Soviet analysts genuinely believed a Western first strike might be imminent during that period. They had prepared for it, not because it happened, but because they feared it might. Able Archer 83 became a lesson written in hindsight. It showed how realism in military exercises can unintentionally create strategic alarm. It demonstrated how distrust amplifies perception. And it proved that nuclear stability depends not only on weapons or treaties, but on clarity of communication. The world survived that November. But survival did not mean safety was guaranteed. The margin between simulation and reality had been thinner than anyone realized at the time. Soviet forces on alert and the invisible threshold. After Able Archer 83 ended, many Western commanders believed the exercise had passed like any other training event. There was relief. There was routine debriefing. There was analysis of internal performance. But what they did not immediately know was how closely Soviet forces had monitored the event and how seriously it had been interpreted. Inside the Soviet military structure under Yuri Andropov, the exercise had triggered precautionary responses. These responses were not publicly announced. They were handled quietly through military command channels. Certain units reportedly moved to higher alert status. Nuclear-capable aircraft in parts of Eastern Europe were prepared for rapid deployment. Missile forces evaluated readiness procedures. These actions reflected worst-case planning. Soviet doctrine emphasized preparedness for sudden attack. If leaders believed an adversary might strike without warning, they had to ensure retaliation capability survived. So when signals from NATO appeared consistent with escalation toward nuclear release, readiness adjustments followed. Importantly, readiness is not the same as launch authorization. Raising alert status means systems are prepared. It does not mean weapons are fired. But in a nuclear environment, the difference between preparation and aggression can be difficult to observe from outside. Imagine radar operators seeing aircraft dispersal. Imagine intelligence analysts detecting increased command activity. Without context, those signals might appear offensive. During November 1983, that possibility existed. Fortunately, communication channels, though limited, prevented immediate miscalculation. There were intelligence assessments comparing reports from multiple sources. There were internal debates within Soviet leadership about how to interpret NATO behavior. Some officials may have argued that the exercise was excessive realism, but still training. Others likely warned that it could conceal hostile intent. Ultimately, caution prevailed. Soviet forces remained on alert, but did not escalate to preemptive action. At the same time, NATO forces did not observe large-scale mobilization from the Warsaw Pact that would suggest an imminent attack. This mutual restraint prevented escalation from crossing the invisible threshold into active conflict. The invisible threshold is an important concept. It refers to the point at which defensive preparation transforms into offensive action. In nuclear strategy, that threshold is often unclear until it is crossed. During Able Archer 83, both sides approached that line, but neither stepped over it. Years later, when declassified documents became available, historians discovered intelligence memos describing Soviet concern during the exercise. Some reports indicated genuine fear that the drill could be masking preparations for a first strike. Those assessments were serious enough that military readiness increased. But they also showed something significant. Even under suspicion, Soviet leaders chose monitoring and preparation rather than immediate retaliation. That decision mattered, because if Soviet forces had interpreted the exercise as confirmed attack preparation and responded aggressively, perhaps by raising forces to full wartime posture or mobilizing nuclear assets, NATO might have detected those moves and interpreted them as confirmation of hostile intent. Escalation could then have followed automatically through defensive reactions. The fact that this did not happen demonstrates how fragile stability was and how much it depended on restraint. President Ronald Reagan later expressed surprise when intelligence reports revealed how seriously the Soviet Union had interpreted events during that period. Many American officials at the time were unaware that their exercise had generated such alarm. That gap in awareness is critical. It shows that transparency between adversaries was limited. Limited transparency increases risk, because when actions are misread, intentions are guessed, and guesses in nuclear politics can be dangerous. Able Archer 83 became one of the clearest examples of how military realism combined with geopolitical tension can unintentionally simulate war in the minds of observers. The lesson was not that exercises should be unrealistic. The lesson was that communication about exercises matters. If an adversary understands clearly that an activity is training, fear decreases. If ambiguity remains, worst-case assumptions fill the gap. In November 1983, ambiguity existed. But despite that ambiguity, escalation stopped. Missiles stayed in storage. Aircraft returned to normal operations. Alert levels gradually normalized. The invisible threshold was approached, but it was not crossed. How close did the world actually come? For decades after 1983, many people asked a difficult question. Was the danger during Able Archer 83 exaggerated in hindsight? Or was it truly one of the closest moments the world came to nuclear war? The answer, based on declassified documents and later testimonies, suggests the danger was real. Not because missiles were launched, not because a direct confrontation happened, but because Soviet leadership reportedly interpreted the exercise as potentially masking a first strike. Inside the Soviet system under Yuri Andropov, intelligence assessments reflected concern that NATO might be testing procedures for an actual nuclear transition. Some archival documents indicate that military units were placed on heightened alert. Nuclear-capable aircraft were reportedly prepared for rapid deployment. Missile forces adjusted readiness. These actions did not equal mobilization for war, but they showed seriousness. At the same time, NATO forces under leadership structures tied to commanders like General Bernard W. Rogers did not detect clear signs that the Soviet Union was preparing an immediate strike. From the Western perspective during the exercise, Soviet activity did not appear to cross into overt mobilization. That mutual lack of visible extreme escalation is what prevented crisis from turning into catastrophe. But how close is close in nuclear terms? In conventional conflict, proximity is measured by territory captured or battles fought. In nuclear crisis, proximity is measured by decision time. During Able Archer 83, decision time on both sides was already compressed by missile technology and forward deployments. If Soviet early warning systems had misinterpreted a radar anomaly during that period as confirmation of an actual attack, combined with existing tension, retaliation might have been authorized quickly. If NATO had observed sudden large-scale Soviet force mobilization and interpreted it as preparation for attack, preemptive countermeasures could have followed. Escalation could have become automatic. The danger lay not in intent, but in misreading signals under pressure. Later assessments by historians and intelligence analysts suggested that Soviet fear during the exercise was deeper than many Western officials realized at the time. Some analysts concluded that certain Soviet nuclear forces were moved closer to readiness than during typical exercises. However, there is no evidence that authorization for launch was ever issued. The system remained in a heightened defensive posture, not offensive activation. One key factor that likely prevented escalation was timing. Although tensions were high in 1983, communication channels between the superpowers still existed. Diplomatic contact had not completely collapsed. Intelligence assessments continued to be shared cautiously. That limited communication allowed leaders to avoid jumping immediately to worst-case conclusions. Another factor was restraint at leadership level. Despite suspicion, Soviet leaders did not assume automatically that the exercise equaled imminent attack. They increased vigilance, but stopped short of irreversible actions. That hesitation mattered, because nuclear systems, once activated beyond a certain point, become difficult to reverse. History shows that many Cold War crises were resolved not through perfect understanding, but through controlled uncertainty. Able Archer 83 fits into that pattern. The world did not experience visible confrontation. There were no public emergency announcements. No emergency summit was required to stop a launch that had already begun. Instead, danger existed quietly, inside interpretation models and intelligence reports. After the Cold War ended, archived Soviet documents revealed how seriously some officials had evaluated the situation. These documents confirmed that alarm existed. They also confirmed that precautionary measures were taken. But they also show something equally important. The Soviet leadership ultimately chose monitoring over retaliation. That choice prevented escalation. Looking back, analysts often describe 1983 as one of the most dangerous years of the Cold War, not because war happened, but because war almost became believable. And when war becomes believable in nuclear systems, action can follow belief quickly. The lesson from this period is not fear. It is awareness. It shows that transparency between adversaries reduces risk. It shows that clearer communication about military exercises can prevent misinterpretation. And it shows that stability depends on human judgment as much as technological control. The question, how close did we come, cannot be answered with an exact distance. But based on evidence from both sides, the answer appears to be closer than most people knew at the time, yet far enough away because restraint held. What America did not see. During the days of Able Archer 83, most American officials believed the exercise was proceeding normally. There were internal briefings. There were after-action reports. There was routine evaluation of how well command procedures functioned. But what they did not fully understand at the time was how deeply the Soviet Union was analyzing every signal. In Washington, under President Ronald Reagan, intelligence agencies monitored Soviet military activity through satellites, intercepted communications, and Allied reporting. They observed some increases in Soviet readiness during November 1983. However, those changes were not immediately interpreted as evidence that Moscow believed war was imminent. In other words, the alarm inside the Soviet system was not fully visible to the West. This asymmetry of awareness is important. It means one side can feel extreme danger, while the other side sees normal patterns. That difference creates risk, because reactions may not align. At the time, many American policymakers assumed that Soviet doctrine treated military exercises as standard components of Cold War competition. They understood that the Soviet Union often responded to NATO drills with precautionary readiness. But they did not realize that Operation Ryan, the intelligence directive initiated under Yuri Andropov, had elevated fear to a higher level than usual. Ryan instructed agents worldwide to search specifically for indicators of a surprise nuclear strike. So when Able Archer began simulating nuclear authorization procedures with high realism, Soviet observers did not categorize it as routine. They compared it against their checklist for potential attack preparation. That comparison triggered concern. Inside NATO command centers, officers followed scripted communications. They transmitted messages as part of training. They did not intend those messages to signal aggression. But signals, once transmitted, leave the secure environment and enter the intelligence space. Their interpretation begins. In hindsight, historians found that American intelligence eventually detected signs that Soviet forces had increased readiness during the exercise. However, the depth of Soviet anxiety was not immediately recognized. The gap between perception and reality meant that neither side fully understood how tense the situation had become. If American leaders had known exactly how seriously Moscow interpreted the exercise, they might have adjusted communication strategy, perhaps clarifying publicly that Able Archer was a drill. Similarly, clearer advance notification might have reduced suspicion. But at the time, transparency was limited. Communication between adversaries was cautious and slow. Another important factor was timing within the broader Cold War context. Just months after Able Archer 83, diplomatic dynamics would begin shifting. By the mid-1980s, leadership changes and arms control negotiations gradually improved dialogue between the superpowers. Eventually, Mikhail Gorbachev would rise to power and pursue reforms, along with nuclear reduction agreements. Those later developments reduced the probability of similar misunderstandings. But in 1983, that shift had not yet occurred. America did not see the full extent of Soviet fear during Able Archer. It saw routine exercise behavior. It saw limited intelligence indication of increased Soviet readiness. It did not see internal Soviet debates about whether war might be imminent. That invisibility is what made the event dangerous, because risk often hides inside what one side cannot observe about the other. The lesson from this period is clear. Military exercises in nuclear rivalries must consider not only operational effectiveness, but also adversary perception. Even defensive training can be misread if context is not clearly communicated. Able Archer 83 passed without incident, but it left behind a silent warning that misunderstanding in high-stakes environments can move systems closer to conflict without either side intending it. The moment the exercise ended, on November 11, 1983, the final phase of Able Archer 83 concluded. Inside NATO headquarters, officers completed their simulated nuclear command procedures. Messages were marked as training material. Systems were reset to normal readiness. Debriefings began. From the Western perspective, the exercise had achieved its objective, testing command coordination and improving preparedness for potential escalation. There was no public announcement that anything extraordinary had occurred. To most observers in Europe and the United States, it was simply another successful military drill. But inside parts of the Soviet system, the conclusion of the exercise was interpreted with cautious relief. Under the leadership of Yuri Andropov, intelligence agencies monitored signals closely during and after the exercise to confirm whether NATO activity returned to normal patterns. As communications traffic decreased and alert indicators gradually normalized, Soviet analysts assessed that immediate attack did not materialize. The worst-case scenario, a surprise nuclear strike disguised as an exercise, had not occurred. That realization reduced immediate tension. However, the relief did not erase concern. Soviet leaders reportedly concluded that the exercise demonstrated how easily misunderstandings could escalate. They recognized that NATO had not intended aggression, but they also believed that future exercises might create similar ambiguity. In the months following the drill, intelligence assessments continued analyzing the event. Internal reports examined whether the Soviet response had been appropriate. Military planners reviewed readiness adjustments to determine if escalation had been necessary or excessive. At the same time, NATO analysts later discovered through intelligence sharing that Soviet forces had elevated alert levels during the exercise. But during November 1983 itself, that knowledge was incomplete. The system had passed a stress test without collapsing. That outcome was fortunate, because once nuclear forces move beyond alert into actual launch preparation, reversing course becomes extremely difficult. The end of the exercise did not generate headlines about crisis resolution. There were no emergency summits required to stop an ongoing launch sequence. The danger had existed inside perception, and perception changed when the simulation ended. One important lesson emerged afterward. Exercises that simulate nuclear escalation must be carefully designed with transparency in mind. Clear communication, especially advanced notification to adversaries, can reduce suspicion. In later years, NATO and the Soviet Union would improve mechanisms for military transparency, including notification of major exercises and observation agreements. Those reforms were influenced partly by experiences like Able Archer 83. Looking back, analysts often describe the moment the exercise ended as quietly significant. It marked the point at which tension that had built during the simulation gradually dissipated. Missile forces returned to standard posture. Aircraft resumed routine readiness. Command centers shifted focus from crisis simulation back to normal training cycles. Yet the memory of how close suspicion had brought the system to potential danger remained. For historians studying the Cold War, the conclusion of Able Archer 83 is not dramatic, but it is instructive. It shows that stability sometimes survives not because conditions are peaceful, but because actors choose restraint at critical moments. It also shows that survival in nuclear rivalry depends on continuous awareness of how actions are interpreted by the other side. When the exercise ended, the immediate risk decreased. But the broader strategic tension between the superpowers continued until deeper political changes in the mid to late 1980s transformed relations. The story of Able Archer 83, therefore, does not end with the exercise itself. It ends with reflection. Reflection on how misunderstanding can push systems toward danger, and reflection on how careful judgment prevented that danger from becoming disaster. What we learned after the Soviet Union fell. For many years after Able Archer 83 ended, much of what happened inside Soviet decision-making circles remained classified. Western governments knew that Soviet forces had reacted with caution, but they did not fully understand how serious that reaction had been. That changed after the collapse of the Soviet Union. When the Soviet state dissolved in 1991, archives gradually opened to historians, researchers, and intelligence analysts. Documents from military headquarters, KGB reports, and internal assessments became accessible. Those records revealed something important. They confirmed that Soviet leadership under Yuri Andropov had taken the exercise very seriously. Intelligence reports from the period show that Operation RYAN, the directive instructing agents to search for signs of a Western nuclear first strike, was actively guiding analysis during the time of the exercise. The documents indicate that Soviet officials did not dismiss Able Archer as routine training. Instead, they evaluated it against their worst-case scenarios. Some reports suggested that certain military units were placed on elevated alert. Others recorded concern that NATO procedures during the exercise resembled genuine nuclear authorization steps. These findings surprised many Western analysts. Before the archives opened, some experts believed the alarm might have been exaggerated after the fact. But the internal Soviet records demonstrated that the fear was documented in real time. The realization changed historical interpretation. It established that the danger was not imagined later, it was experienced at the time. At the same time, the documents also clarified something reassuring. Despite concern, Soviet leadership did not authorize preemptive nuclear action. Even under suspicion, decision-makers chose monitoring and defensive preparation rather than escalation toward launch. That restraint was crucial. Another insight from post-Cold War research involved communication gaps. The records showed that both sides lacked full awareness of how their actions appeared externally. NATO planners designed realistic exercises to improve readiness. They did not fully anticipate that realism could trigger alarm under existing geopolitical tension. Soviet analysts interpreted that realism through a lens shaped by Operation RYAN and fears of surprise attack. The mismatch between intent and interpretation created risk. Historians now often describe Able Archer 83 as one of the most dangerous nuclear moments of the Cold War, not because weapons were fired, but because both sides came close to acting on worst-case assumptions. The event also influenced later policy. In subsequent years, NATO and Warsaw Pact communication about major military exercises improved. Confidence-building measures were introduced to reduce suspicion. verification, mechanisms under arms control agreements expanded transparency. Eventually, leaders like Mikhail Gorbachev pursued policies that reduced confrontation and promoted dialogue on nuclear reduction. Those later reforms were shaped partly by lessons learned from near misses such as Able Archer. The historical record now suggests an important conclusion. The Cold War did not end in nuclear disaster, not only because of deterrence, but also because restraint operated even during moments of misunderstanding. Able Archer 83 stands as evidence that the system was fragile. It also stands as evidence that human judgment prevented escalation when systems created ambiguity. When researchers examine the archives today, they see clear documentation of fear. They see alert orders. They see intelligence warnings. But they also see careful decision-making that stopped short of irreversible action. That combination, fear plus restraint, defines the legacy of the event. The world survived that period, but survival was not guaranteed. It depended on leaders choosing caution over reaction. And that choice, repeated during tense days in November 1983, helped prevent catastrophe. The silent lesson of near extinction. When historians look back at Able Archer 83 today, they do not describe it as a battle. They describe it as a warning. A warning about how close misunderstanding can bring nuclear powers to irreversible escalation, even when no one intends war. In November 1983, NATO conducted a highly realistic command exercise designed to strengthen readiness. At the same time, Soviet leadership under Yuri Andropov interpreted the activity through the lens of worst-case analysis and Operation RYAN, a program created to detect signs of a surprise nuclear attack. The two perspectives collided. One side saw training. The other side saw potential deception. That difference created tension, but it did not create war. Looking back with access to declassified documents, researchers now understand that Soviet forces did increase alert levels during the exercise. Military units adjusted readiness. Nuclear-capable assets were prepared for rapid response. Intelligence agencies monitored signals intensely. These actions demonstrate that the fear was real, not symbolic. Yet despite heightened alert posture, Soviet leadership did not issue launch orders. They monitored. They prepared. They refrained. That restraint is critical to understanding why the crisis ended without escalation. In Washington, President Ronald Reagan and senior officials did not initially realize how deeply the exercise had been misinterpreted in Moscow. American intelligence later assessed that the Soviet reaction was more serious than expected. But during the exercise itself, awareness of that reaction was incomplete. The gap between perception and reality was large. And that gap is what made the situation dangerous. The silent lesson from Able Archer 83 is not that military exercises are inherently unsafe. Exercises are necessary for preparedness. The lesson is that transparency and communication are essential when nuclear-capable adversaries conduct realistic simulations. If intent is not clearly understood, worst-case assumptions fill the void. Those assumptions can drive defensive actions. Those defensive actions can be interpreted as aggression. And escalation can occur through feedback rather than intention. Another important lesson is the role of human judgment. Technology detected signals. Intelligence systems generated reports. Alert mechanisms activated. But at key moments, leaders chose caution. Soviet authorities evaluated the possibility of attack, but did not act on fear alone. That decision prevented irreversible escalation. In the broader context of the Cold War, Able Archer 83 became one of several near-miss events that demonstrated both the danger and stability of nuclear deterrence. Deterrence worked, but it worked not because systems were perfect. It worked because leaders avoided crossing the threshold from suspicion into action. After the Cold War ended and archives became accessible, scholars confirmed that the crisis had been more intense than many Western officials realized at the time. The historical record shows that nuclear risk in 1983 was not theoretical. It was operational. Yet it also shows that diplomacy, caution, and restraint ultimately prevailed. Today, the story of Able Archer 83 serves as a reminder for modern security policy. Military transparency reduces misunderstanding. Clear communication about exercises reduces panic. Verification mechanisms reduce uncertainty. And most importantly, awareness of history reduces the chance of repeating dangerous misinterpretations. The world in 1983 stood closer to nuclear uncertainty than most people understood. It survived, but survival required careful decisions in moments of fear. That is the silent lesson of near extinction.
We need to address these imbalances. Your terms are one-sided. It's a fair deal.